am very much in line with some of the points made by Mr. Ehlers. However, I should also say that I come from the state of Washington. I am downriver from the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, which is not cleaned by a darn sight. Obviously, it was not a nuclear power issue initially, but nevertheless is a substantial nuclear waste issue today. And we're also from the state that had the Washington Public Power Supply System debacle, the largest bond default, I think, in the history of the country up to that point. And it's not just, seems to me, I have sort of two questions. One, if somebody could give us a handle of the total net federal subsidies thus far that have gone into nuclear energy, and that would include development, design, indemnification, et cetera, et cetera. And then the second question is, what can we do if we spend it on not coal, not nuclear, but something else? And take, for example, more fuel-efficient heat sources, et cetera, et cetera. What are the returns on investment and the relative risks and costs of those? More efficient heat pumps, in-ground heat pumps, in line with Mr. Bilbray's question, don't require any new generation generation or transmission capacity. So two questions. What about subsidies, and what about alternatives? And the final one would be, if any of you want to volunteer, whether or not you've asked the administration to increase funding to clean up Hanford. We would certainly welcome that. If you're asking for new money for new power plants, to clean up your mess beforehand would be great. So anybody want to take any three of those? Dr. Cochran?
I think it's difficult getting a handle on the total federal subsidies to nuclear power in the United States. I've seen numbers on the order of $150 billion, probably includes direct and indirect subsidies.
Total over the lifespan of the enterprise?
Yes. I mean, the industry was built on the back of the submarine program, propulsion program. It had enormous subsidies in its early career. We spent tens of billions on the fast breeder reactor and some other technologies that didn't come to fruition. It's a mature industry now. It's a 50-year-old industry in the United States, and the subsidies that are being provided today are not going to change the underlying economics between fossil fuels and nuclear, the base load energy generation.
And yet
they're basically subsidies to build a few new nuclear plants. And the only way you can change the really underlying economic differential is to internalize the true cost to society of emitting carbon. And I would use the federal subsidies. I would look to where the Wall Street money is going in terms of these energy technologies. Where's the high-risk money going out in the Palo Alto area? And it's going towards new solar technologies and a number of other areas.
Mr. Hasseltine?
I would agree with Tom. I think it's very difficult to quantify the past support.
It's sunk costs anyway, but so
that's right. It's much easier to look at the financial support that's now being provided for the next generation of plants. And if you look at the Energy Policy Act, you can work through the numbers fairly easily. There's a production tax credit of 1.8 cents per kilowatt hour for up to 6,000 megawatts of new generation, very similar to the production tax credit that is provided for renewable energy resources as well. So if you took that 6,000 megawatts over 8 years with the cap of 125 million per 1,000 megawatts per year for nuclear, that's $6 billion over the 8-year time period.
But is that not somewhat specious because there's not waste disposal problems of the same magnitude? I mean, so you've got a production tax credit, which is a direct subsidy, but what about waste disposal issues, transportation, et cetera?
Waste disposal, the Nuclear Waste Policy Policy Act did impose a mandatory charge for utilities for nuclear generation that's been in effect since the mid-1980s, where the utilities have paid 1 mil per kilowatt hour for every kilowatt hour of electricity generated by nuclear power plants in the country. That money has gone to the Treasury to fund the waste disposal program. And if anything, what we've seen over that time period is the federal government failed to meet its obligation to take the waste, and if anything, courts have now been returning some of that money or compensating utilities for their ongoing storage costs. So I would argue on the waste side, the utilities were pay-as-you-go from the mid-1980s and continue that way today. And the assumption is if you have new nuclear power plants going forward, those plants will also be assessed for their for the waste disposal costs down the road. You can also look at the standby risk insurance, which provides protection against licensing and litigation delays for 6 units. If that risk insurance is actually needed and used, that would be about $2 billion. And the Congress has appropriated about $18.5 billion in funding for loan guarantees for the nuclear plants. Add all of those up, it's about $26 billion. If the chairman pointed out in his opening comments, we now have applications or statements from the utilities that they intend to apply for licenses for 25 to 30 new units. So the trade-off would be about $26 billion in federal support to help ensure that we might get 25 to 30 new nuclear power plants over, say, the next 20 years or so. Those 25 to 30 new plants would mean that nuclear, taking into account the Energy Information Agency's projection about growth in electricity demand, would keep nuclear at about 20% of our generating mix going forward. My own personal view is that's the Congress made a reasonable decision to provide that support to get about 25 to 30 new plants to keep nuclear at 20% of our generating mix. And why is that beneficial? It makes the challenges of dealing with carbon, with the coal-fired generation, easier to deal with. It makes dealing with price volatility for natural gas somewhat easier to deal with, and it keeps nuclear in the balance of its current contributions to our generating mix. My own view is that's a reasonable trade-off and reasonable value for the federal support going forward.
Appreciate it. I would like to let others testify or speak, but I've exceeded my own time, and I try not to use that as a chair. No one offered that they want to increase funding for cleanup of Hanford, but we'd sure welcome that at some point.